By the mid-20th century, Kerala stood at a crossroads. The social reform movements had cracked the legitimacy of caste hierarchy. Literacy was rising. Consciousness was changing. But awareness alone does not dismantle power. The upper castes still owned the land. The working classes still depended on them for survival. And dependence, economic dependence, sustains hierarchy even when moral legitimacy has collapsed. This episode examines how Kerala's social struggle evolved into a political one, how a region steeped in feudal inequality became the site of one of the world's most dramatic redistributions of power, how land reform, state policy, and electoral democracy combined to rewrite the political map of South India. This transformation was not inevitable. It was contested. It was fought for. And it offers lessons that extend far beyond Kerala's borders. As caste legitimacy weakened, economic inequality came into sharper focus. The early 20th century saw the emergence of organized labor movements across Kerala. These were not abstract ideological movements imported from elsewhere. They were responses to concrete conditions of exploitation. In the coir industry of central Kerala, workers, mostly from oppressed castes, labored in hazardous conditions for minimal wages. In the cashew factories of the north, women worked long hours with little security. In the tea and rubber plantations of the hills, tribal and migrant laborers lived in conditions barely removed from bondage. The first trade unions emerged in the 1920s and 30s. Initially fragmented, they began to coalesce around demands that went beyond wages. They demanded dignity, representation, political voice. Into this landscape stepped a new generation of political organizers. Many came from privileged backgrounds, Brahmins, Nayars, educated elites, but they broke with their class interests. They studied Marxist theory. They organized workers. They built political consciousness. The communist movement in Kerala did not emerge as a top-down, ideological imposition. It grew from the ground up, from peasant associations, labor strikes, tenant-farmer organizations. It provided a language and a framework for struggles that were already underway. By the 1940s, Kerala was experiencing intense political mobilization. The independence movement was accelerating. But in Kerala, the question was not just independence from Britain. It was independence from landlordism, from caste hierarchy, from economic bondage. In 1946, in the princely state of Travancore, workers and peasants rose in armed revolt against the Diwan's repressive policies. The Punapra Vayalar uprising was brutally suppressed. Hundreds were killed. But it signaled something irreversible. The masses were no longer willing to accept their subordination. When India gained independence in 1947, Kerala as we know it did not yet exist. The region was divided between the princely states of Travancore and Cochin and the Malabar district of Madras Presidency. These would not unite to form Kerala until 1956, but political organizing continued across these boundaries. In the 1952 general elections, India's first, the Communist Party emerged as a significant force in Travancore-Cochin. In local body elections across the region, they won seats. They proved they could mobilize voters across caste lines. And then came 1957. In April 1957, the newly formed state of Kerala went to the polls. The Communist Party of India, running on a platform of land reform education expansion, and social justice, won a legislative majority. On April 5, 1957, EMS Namboodiripad became the Chief Minister of Kerala, leading the world's first democratically elected communist government. This was not ideological imitation. This was not Soviet influence. This was a response to lived inequality. Kerala's voters, a majority of them poor, landless, or marginally landed, chose a government that promised to dismantle the economic structures that oppressed them. The world watched. Could democracy and radical redistribution coexist? Land reform became the most decisive intervention. To understand why, we must first understand what land meant in traditional Kerala society. The janmi system concentrated land ownership in the hands of a tiny elite, mostly Nambudiri Brahmins and some Nair families. These landlords did not cultivate land themselves. They leased it to tenants who paid rent, sometimes as high as 50 to 70% of the produce. Tenants had no security. They could be evicted at will. They could not make improvements without permission. They lived in perpetual uncertainty. Below the tenants were agricultural laborers, landless workers from the most oppressed castes, who owned nothing and depended entirely on daily wages. This was not merely an economic arrangement. It was a system of control. Land ownership was political power. It determined who spoke in village councils, who had influence with the state, whose children went to school. When the communist government came to power in 1957, land reform was at the top of their agenda. But they faced enormous obstacles. The landed elite mobilized against them. The Congress Party, which represented many upper caste interests, launched fierce opposition. The Catholic Church, which owned significant land, joined the resistance. In 1959, a massive agitation called the Vimochana Samaram, the liberation struggle, erupted. Funded and organized by landlords, supported by religious institutions, it paralyzed the state. The central government, led by Prime Minister Nehru, dismissed the communist government in July 1959. The first communist government had lasted just 28 months, but they had passed the Kerala Agrarian Relations Bill, a comprehensive land reform measure. Though it was not immediately implemented, the template was set. When communists returned to power in the late 1960s and through the 1970s, they resumed the reform process. This time, they succeeded. The reforms did several things. Tenants were given permanent rights to the land they cultivated. They could no longer be arbitrarily evicted. This single measure transformed their relationship to the land and to power. Rents were capped at a fraction of what they had been. What had been extraction became manageable payment. Tenants could now retain enough of their produce to improve their lives. A ceiling was placed on how much land any individual could own. Excess land was acquired by the government and redistributed to landless laborers. The janmi system was formally abolished. The chain of intermediaries between the state and the cultivator was broken. This was not simply redistribution of land. It was redistribution of power. For tenant families, the change was existential. A man who had worked land his entire life without owning a square foot of it now held title. A woman who had feared eviction with every harvest now had security. Children who would have inherited debt now inherited property. And with property came possibility. Families could invest. They could educate their children. They could think in terms of generations, not just seasons. By the 1980s, Kerala had one of the most equitable land distribution patterns in India. The percentage of landless agricultural laborers had dropped significantly. Small and marginal farmers now constituted the majority of landholders. Compare this to states like Bihar or Uttar Pradesh, where land reforms were sabotaged by the same classes that wrote the laws. In those states, land concentration remained extreme. Feudal hierarchies persisted. Political power remained with landlords. Kerala chose differently. Not because its elites were more enlightened, they resisted just as fiercely, but because its political movements were strong enough to overcome that resistance. Hierarchy depends on dependence. When dependence weakened, hierarchy followed. A tenant who owns his land does not bow to a janmi. A laborer with options does not accept starvation wages. A community with collective strength does not submit to individual domination. Land reform did not end inequality. Economic differences remained. But it broke the spine of feudal power. Education became a public priority. Kerala's literacy revolution is often treated as a mystery, an anomaly in the Indian context. But there was nothing mysterious about it. It was a deliberate political choice. Kerala had a head start. Missionary schools had created pockets of literacy in the 19th century. Social reform movements had emphasized education. By 1947, Kerala's literacy rate was already higher than the Indian average, but it was still low in absolute terms, around 47% in Travancore Cochin in 1951, and it was deeply unequal. Upper caste communities had high literacy. Oppressed castes, especially in rural areas, remained largely illiterate. The 1957 communist government made education expansion central to its program. They opened thousands of new schools. They recruited teachers aggressively. They made primary education accessible even in remote villages. But they also did something more radical. They sought to regulate and integrate private schools, many of which were run by religious institutions, into a unified system with common standards. This sparked part of the fierce resistance that led to their dismissal in 1959. The Catholic Church, which ran an extensive network of schools, saw this as an attack on their autonomy. They mobilized against the government. But the momentum was irreversible. Successive governments, communist and Congress alike, continued to invest in education. Schools multiplied. Libraries opened in villages. Adult literacy programs were launched. By 1961, Kerala's literacy rate was 47%. By 1971, it was 60%. By 1981, it was 70%. By 1991, it was 90%. Today, it exceeds 94%, among the highest in the developing world. While all of India made progress, Kerala's trajectory was steeper. The gap between Kerala and the national average widened, not narrowed over time. But the real achievement was not just the numbers. It was who became literate. Kerala achieved near-universal female literacy, a rarity in South Asia. Girls from all castes and communities went to school. This transformed gender dynamics in ways that statistics cannot fully capture. A literate mother makes different choices about her children's health, education, marriage. She has greater agency within the household. She is more likely to participate in public life. Similarly, literacy broke the monopoly that upper castes had held on knowledge and professional opportunities. Dalit and OBC communities produced their own teachers, administrators, writers, and intellectuals. Kerala developed a culture of reading. Village libraries became community institutions. Newspapers had among the highest circulation rates in India. Political literacy accompanied functional literacy. An educated populace is a politicized populace. They ask questions, they demand accountability. They cannot be as easily manipulated or controlled. Education did not erase inequality. Economic differences persisted. Caste identities endured. New forms of discrimination emerged. But it reduced the inheritance of oppression. A Dalit child born in 1960, Kerala had a chance, not a guarantee, but a chance, to escape the occupation and status of their parents. A girl born to an illiterate family could grow up to be a teacher, a nurse, an administrator. This was the power of state policy aligned with social mobilization. Education was not left to charity or market forces. It was treated as a public good, a right, an investment in collective transformation. Modern Kerala is not free of contradiction. Economic growth has been uneven. Unemployment remains high, especially among educated youth. Tens of thousands migrate to the Gulf for work. Political parties engage in petty rivalry and occasional violence. Caste discrimination has not disappeared. It has taken new, subtler forms. Consumer culture has brought new inequalities. Real estate speculation has displaced the poor. The environment has suffered from unplanned development. And yet, Kerala has the highest life expectancy in India, the lowest infant mortality, near total literacy, sex ratios that favor women, a rarity in a country where female infanticide and gender discrimination remain widespread. Its public health system, though strained, remains more accessible and equitable than in most of India. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Kerala's response became a model of public health intervention. Political engagement remains high. Voter turnout in elections often exceeds 75%. Citizens mobilize, protest, demand, participate. This did not happen by accident. It is the cumulative result of more than a century of social reform, political organizing, and state intervention. From the self-respect movements of the early 1900s, which challenged caste ideology, to the temple entry struggles of the 1920s and 30s, which asserted the dignity of the oppressed, to the labor movements of the 1940s, which organized workers across caste lines, to the electoral victory of 1957, which brought a government committed to structural change, to the land reforms that broke the economic basis of feudalism, to the education policies that created one of the most literate populations in the developing world, from caste rigidity to mass literacy, from economic captivity to political participation, from hierarchy accepted as natural to equality demanded as a right. This is the essence of cold frames. History is rarely erased. The old remains visible beneath the new. Caste identities persist. Economic inequalities endure. The past is never simply past, but the past can be rewritten, not by forgetting it, not by pretending it didn't matter, but by struggling against it, by organizing, by demanding change, by using state power to redistribute private power. Kerala's transformation was fought for. It was contested at every step. It remains incomplete. But it proves something essential, that even the most rigid hierarchies can be challenged, that even the deepest inequalities can be reduced, that politics, collective action toward structural change, matters.